Have you ever spent the entire day resting only to wake up the next morning still exhausted? That's because rest and recovery aren't the same thing. Hi, I'm Alex. I'm your nurse, and today we're talking about recovery, what it actually means to be well rested. Most people think recovery means doing less, but physiologically, recovery is actually an active process occurring throughout the body. So, let's break down what it is and how it affects our health and how to support adequate recovery. So, what is recovery? Recovery is the process by which the body restores physiological, neurological, hormonal, and psychological function following stress. And stress could be exercise and illness, work, travel, sleep deprivation, emotional stress from major life events, or just in general. But essentially, there is a stressor, and then your body is having to recover from it. So, recovery is essentially the body's repair phase. And this can be through sleep and rest, which is not the same thing, and then also refueling. So, let's talk about each of those specifically. So, sleep is the most powerful recovery tool. This is why you get a lot of people preaching about how to sleep and have good sleep hygiene and how much sleep you should be getting each night, because it's really important for your health overall. So, during sleep, growth hormone increases, tissue repair occurs, memory consolidation occurs, as well as restoration of immune function, and then lymphatic waste clearance also increases. So, sleep is when the body performs maintenance. It's doing all of these other processes that aren't being done, or rather, are being done while you're awake and functioning, but because you're not awake and functioning, your energy resources can go just to the repair instead of the functioning as a whole. So you are still active when you're sleeping, which is why getting adequate sleep and enough sleep is so important, so that these baseline processes can function more appropriately when you are up and functioning. Now, rest is different than sleep. You might still be fully conscious and awake when you are resting. Rest reduces the incoming demands, so this could be quiet time, taking breaks, sitting and resting, reducing stimulation, physiologically or psychologically. Rest creates opportunity for recovery, and recovery is what actually happens during that opportunity. So, rest can be physical, it can also be psychological. It can be taking a break and reading a book and sitting. It can be going on a walk and allowing for that breathing space in your brain from your thoughts. And then refueling. Recovery requires resources. So, the body needs calories, protein, carbohydrates, all the macronutrients and micronutrients, as well as water. Recovery is energetically expensive. You cannot effectively recover while you are chronically underfueled. There's a lot of people, particularly with the rise of GLPs, where they are under eating and they think it is a win. To a point, yes, you do have to be in a deficit to lose weight. But as a baseline minimum for daily living and maintenance, you need a certain amount of intake in order for your body to appropriately function, let alone recover. Okay, so this is why under eating and under fueling can be so detrimental, particularly in certain phases, like if you're trying to build muscle specifically, but just to your health in general. So, how does recovery affect the body? Cellular repair. So, throughout the day, proteins break down, tissues are damaged, and cells accumulate waste products. So, recovery allows for the opposite of that: protein synthesis, tissue repair, and cell maintenance. Okay? For your nervous system, recovery allows the nervous system to shift from the fight or flight sympathetic state towards the rest and digest parasympathetic state. So during this shift, your heart rate will decrease, your blood pressure will as well, digestion can improve, and so can your immune function. For hormonal recovery, recovery influences cortisol regulation, growth hormone, testosterone and estrogen, as well as insulin sensitivity. So inadequate recovery often causes hormonal dysregulation long before diseases actually develop. And then when those hormones are dysregulated, that can further dysregulate your recovery because it's affecting your sleep, your cycle for ladies. And then with the insulin sensitivity and the other hormones involved with appetite, that can then adjust your digestion and your appetite so then you're not adequately refueling appropriately. So it becomes this cycle where inadequate recovery alters your hormones, and then the hormone alteration can cause inadequate recovery. So we want to try to keep these things balanced. But I do want to talk about the differences between mental and physical recovery because they're not the same. Most people understand physical fatigue, few understand cognitive fatigue, and that it can affect you physiologically. So this is why you may not actually feel recovered when resting. Essentially, your brain hasn't turned off. You never left work mode. So you stopped moving and you sat on the couch, but you didn't stop processing. So maybe you're sitting on the couch doom scrolling, or you're just worrying, or you're replaying conversations constantly, checking emails. You're just getting constant mental stimulation and you haven't checked out. So physically resting is not always neurologically recovering. And this is why things like therapy or meditation or breath work are so important, because it can allow your brain to essentially go offline for a little bit. And again, the brain uses roughly 20% of our energy reserves in our body. That's a lot that it's pulling. So if we can give our brains a break, we can give our bodies a break as well. So default mode network is another point that I wanted to talk about. When external tasks stop, the brain often shifts into default mode network, and this is associated with self-reflection, future planning, rumination, and worry. And for some people, quiet time becomes stress time. And so this is one of those situations where meditation or going to sleep can actually be more stressful, is because you don't have the outer stimulation to distract you from the inner stimulation. And that's why these things are actually so much more important, so that you can process them and let them go. But there are also other practices to help reduce rumination, worry, anxiety, things like that, so that you can ideally help to go offline. Many people ultimately aren't physically exhausted, they're just cognitively overloaded, and that can be exhausting. So different practices get different outcomes. Physical movement can rest the mind, and physical rest can rest the body. So physical recovery is restoration of muscles, cognitive tissue, your glycogen stores, hydration status, these more physical processes that we're talking about. And it can often follow exercise, illness, injury, things like that. Psychological recovery is restoration of your attention, your mentation, your stress resilience as a whole. And mental recovery often follows work stress, emotional stress, caregiving, or decision fatigue are a few examples. So mental fatigue activates many of the same physiological stress systems as physical fatigue. Research shows prolonged cognitive work can increase your perceived effort, your stress hormone activity, and your fatigue, even without physical exertion. So this is back to the brain using 20% of your energy stores. Your emotional work is just as physical as the physical work that you've been doing. So just because you sat at a desk all day doesn't mean your body wasn't working. Your brain was still doing some things, and we still need to allow adequate time for that to recover. So, what happens with inadequate recovery? Recovery is when the body restores balance or homeostasis after a stressor, be it physical or psychological. When recovery is insufficient, the body remains in a prolonged stress response. So over time, this can affect nearly every major organ system. So fatigue is not simply just tiredness. This occurs when recovery demands exceed your resources. And it is your body telling you that it needs something, that it needs rest or fuel or what have you, but it is speaking to you. So let's talk a little bit of the physiology behind that. So ATP production, that is energy production, becomes less efficient. So every cell in the body relies on ATP for energy. When stress accumulates and recovery is inadequate, your glycogen stores remain low, your cellular repair is then delayed, and your mitochondria, remember the powerhouse of the cell, which makes all cells work, that becomes less efficient because it has less energy to pull from. So, research shows chronic sleep deprivation and stress impair mitochondrial function and energy production. And this is one reason fatigue feels deeper than simply being tired. It can physically feel like your whole being is just exhausted, even if you did get good sleep, or even if maybe you don't have a stressor going on at the moment. Your body is overloaded. Your body isn't running out of energy, it's becoming less efficient at producing and utilizing it. So, another result of inadequate recovery can be increased illness. I've talked about this a lot before. Your body is doing a lot for the basics, so therefore, any additional stressor outside of that or pathogen makes your body more susceptible to receiving it ultimately. So, sleep deprivation and chronic stress impair immune surveillance, inflammatory regulation, and infection resistance. So, your body's not as adequately or effectively able to fight off said pathogen. So people recovering poorly often become sick more frequently. So during sleep and recovery, immune cells communicate, inflammatory signals are regulated, and your antibodies are produced. And all of these things are really important in your immune system to help it function effectively. So poor recovery interferes with these processes. Research has found individuals sleeping less than 6 hours nightly are significantly more likely to develop viral illnesses after exposure compared with those sleeping even 7+ hours of sleep. So this is why the nightly recommended amount is typically at least 7 hours, if not more. You can also experience mood changes from inadequate recovery, as well as changes in your thought processes and your mentation. So, research consistently links poor recovery and sleep deprivation with anxiety and depression, irritability, and just overall emotional dysregulation. So, your prefrontal cortex function declines. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for planning, decision making, emotional regulation, and your focus. And sleep deprivation significantly reduces activity in this area. So think about when maybe you've traveled somewhere and you didn't get enough sleep, or you're jet lagged and you just can't think straight. You can't feel like you can do anything more than the absolute bare minimum. And this is why. So, consequences of that decline of the prefrontal cortex from lack of recovery can include poor concentration, brain fog, even impulsivity, poor decision making, just irritability as a whole. Another point to make though is amygdala reactivity will increase. So, your amygdala helps process emotions and threats. Studies show sleep deprivation can increase amygdala reactivity by approximately 60%. So, this means greater emotional responses, more irritability, more dysregulation, increased anxiety, and stress. So, the thing that is regulating you, your prefrontal cortex, that decreases, and then the amygdala reactivity increases. So, you're getting the inverse of what you actually need. So when you're exhausted, life doesn't necessarily get harder. Your brain just loses some ability to regulate it. With inadequate recovery, you can also experience hormonal changes. We talked about this a little bit. Chronic inadequate recovery can contribute to elevated cortisol. So recovery helps turn off the stress response. Because you are resting, the body can recover. Without recovery, we have the HPA axis, which is hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal glands. These continue to signal cortisol production. So they haven't gotten the chance in order to either turn down or turn off so that the cortisol is not continually being produced. Now, cortisol gets ostracized a lot. Cortisol in the short term is actually very helpful. Cortisol itself is not bad. Long term, though, this can cause a problem. Okay, so short-term cortisol can help to raise your blood glucose, increase alertness and mobilize energy, because ultimately, while yes, it is a stress response, sometimes that stress response is a good thing because it's helping for you to take action or to accomplish something. But long term, if it stays elevated, problems can emerge because it can impair your sleep, increase anxiety, reduce your immune function, increase inflammation, and actually increase visceral fat accumulation, so the fat around your abdomen and your internal organs. So ultimately, cortisol isn't the villain. Staying in a high cortisol state for too long is, okay? So other hormone changes with inadequate recovery can include reduced testosterone. Both men and women produce testosterone, and it is a very important hormone for both. So lower testosterone can lead to impaired muscle repair, decreased libido, and reduced motivation. So this is observed in chronically stressed or sleep-deprived individuals, and it's particularly well documented in athletes that are experiencing overtraining or underfueling. And this is important because we need the testosterone because it is ultimately a protective and regulating hormone for all of these systems that I just mentioned. Another hormone, growth hormone that I want to talk about, another hormone that I want to talk about is growth hormone. So the majority of growth hormone release occurs during deep sleep. So deep sleep is really important for a lot of this regulation, but this in particular, because growth hormone helps tissue repair, muscle recovery, and protein synthesis. So poor sleep means less opportunity for these processes to occur, and therefore for that regulation to happen, particularly when you're awake. Muscle recovery is a point that I really wanted to talk about because most people think muscle growth occurs in the gym. Training creates damage, but recovery creates adaptation. So just because you're going and training in the gym and lifting a lot of weights doesn't mean you're actually going to see the growth. If you're not refueling and recovering appropriately, that muscle's not going to repair and it's not going to grow effectively. So, protein synthesis. Muscle repair requires amino acids, calories, and sleep. And inadequate recovery reduces the muscle protein synthesis, tissue repair, and adaptation. So therefore, it's doing the opposite of what it needs to in order to grow. So essentially, more work, less progress. As a result of this, this can cause an injury risk increase. So insufficient recovery is associated with increased injury rates, tendon irritation, chronic pain, and often overuse injuries as well. Because tissues never fully restore back to their fully functional state before being used again and having stressors applied again, then they're more likely to be at risk for injury. So what are my nursing tips in order to improve recovery? Recovery is not the absence of activity. Recovery is the restoration of physiological capacity. That is much more nuanced than just get more sleep. So lots of different tips here between mental and physiological regulation, but also fueling and sleep. We want to make sure that we've got an adequate caloric intake. So the bare minimum is 1,200 for adults per day. Okay, so 1,200 calories daily at least for the average adult. That's pretty low. Ideally, men and women, it's going to be different between men and women. Men are going to more often need more calories than females are just because of their larger body composition. But ultimately, for any and all adults, adequate nutrition is required for recovery, and chronically undereating can impair healing, hormonal health, immune function, and energy levels. So there's different macro counters or calorie counters and trackers that you can use, or calculators rather, that you can use to go figure out what works best for you and your current state, depending on your RMR, your needs, XYZ. So you can go calculate that out for yourself. But typically, the advice is at least 1,200 calories, ideally more. So with that, hydration, usual amount is at least 64 ounces daily, but for women, it's roughly 2.7 liters per day. For men, it's 3.7 liters per day. but we want to make sure that we're hydrating appropriately so that our body has enough with which to use. For sleep, I mentioned this a little bit. It's usually 7 to 9 hours overall for adults, but there's been increasing research that has shown that females actually need closer to the 9 to 10 hour mark every night due to our hormone cycles. So overall, 7 to 9 hours for an adult, but 7 to 8 for males, 9 to 10 for females. But we want this to be consistent throughout the week. Try to limit interruptions and awakenings each night and get consistent sleep each night consistently throughout the week. This will help to improve your recovery and your results overall. But then off of that, what can we do when we're awake? So I always advocate for social time. This helps to reduce loneliness. This helps to reduce rumination. This helps to kind of help your brain go in that offline mode that we were talking about, depending on who you're spending your time with. Also, self-time. Take some time for yourself. Go on walks, go journal, go meditate. Do the things for your brain to process. We don't want to constantly be processing because, again, that can be almost dysregulating. But I think a lot of people avoid feeling what they feel or thinking what they think, and this is when we get into doom scrolling and distractions and things like that. And sometimes those can be really helpful and beneficial. So it's definitely a balance of sitting with yourself and sitting with the stuff to work through it, but also giving yourself a break so that you can go breathe and allow that to actually integrate. So I advocate for time in nature. It can be very, very grounding. That is a great way for your body to go, for your brain to go offline. So recover your brain. So we want to make sure that we find some time for our brain and also some time for our bodies. My key takeaways for you. Recovery is not simply about feeling rested. Recovery affects your ATP and energy production, your cortisol and hormone regulation, your immune function, and your emotional regulation. When recovery is inadequate, the body doesn't immediately fail. It slowly shifts resources away from growth, repair, and resilience towards survival. That is why chronic under-recovery often shows up as fatigue, irritability, brain fog, frequent illnesses, long before an actual disease develops. So we want to be able to support our bodies as effectively as possible without stressing it out to recover. So find what works for you, see what's manageable so that you can support your system and support your health and your physiology. Because ultimately, I'm not trying to give you a long laundry list of things to add that you're supposed to do. I'm trying to just give you some tips to be aware of that you can hopefully help integrate so that you can help take care of your health and your body. I hope this helped. Share it with someone who maybe needs a little bit more rest. Please consider subscribing if you found this helpful. I'm here every week to talk about more conversations about your health and your body in a more approachable way. You can follow me at Health Recoded Podcast on Instagram if you have any questions, or leave them in the comments below. I will see you guys next week.